When we enter the story, who are we? As you listen to that story from 1 Kings, which character did you identify with? I'll speak for myself. I wish I always felt like Elijah. He's a superhero. He's a superhero of Scripture. And he's always associated with some miracle. Something big is going to happen when Elijah is in the story. But sometimes when the days stack like waves beating against a lee shore, the widow becomes my doppelganger. She is me and I become her, waiting for the inevitable shoe to fall. Maybe you've experienced that before. Maybe you've experienced some kind of inevitable, some kind of negative. She says, as the Lord your God lives, I've got nothing. I'm waiting to die. I'm going to get a few sticks. I'm going to go home, and I've got just enough meal and oil to make a cake, which sounds terrible. If any of you are thinking about a birthday cake for me, don't use just meal and oil. That sounds like an awful cake. So she's going to have a bad Last Supper and then die. This is a right moment for a miracle. It's a pregnant moment, expectant of something about to happen. Yet we have to be careful. We need to exercise caution and not project some Christian doctrine into what is a narrative story that tells us about God. If God intervenes for Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, will God intervene in every occurrence in our lives? Certainly not. They waited desperately and in vain for a miracle at Auschwitz. Many of us have waited and prayed for and hoped for a minor miracle, a minor transformation, or a major one. And things turned out differently than we anticipated. Elijah, as a character, as a story, all of the events associated with him shows us what is possible. Ravens show up and serve him food at one point. In this story, we have the endless jars of oil and meal, which, if you're starving, by the way, that is a delicious feast. He resurrects a boy from the dead. Not just any boy, but the widow of Zarephath's son. And that's coming up in just a few verses and depicted brilliantly in a wonderful piece of classical artwork on the cover of your bulletin. And when the time comes for Elijah to go and meet his Maker, how does he go? Chariots of fire. Amazing. For me, this initial command from the Lord, go to Zarephath, invokes the rest of the story. I hear Zarephath, and my mind fills in the rest. They foreshadow God's movement. Yes, I want to say, things might seem bleak now, but just wait. God is about to do something. Too often we miss the sense of God about to do something. Readers, us this morning can accept, go to Zarephath, that opening line of the story, as an indication of God's work in history. The name notifies the readers of a foreign city, a city with inhabitants who do not worship the God of Israel. And Elijah is supposed to go there and live. The Lord's instructions include this little proviso in verse 9. I have instructed a widow there to feed you. Were there no widows in Israel? What is so special about going to this foreign, Baal-worshipping land? Well, I don't know about you, but sometimes someplace else is special, maybe even necessary. We see things differently in a new place. Our senses senses are heightened to the sights and sounds and smells. I compare it to my trips to Haiti. The mixture of tropical spices floating on warm Caribbean breezes with unfamiliar words and music and torrid smells of rotting food and waste. Just being in Port-au-Prince makes me aware of God because I am aware of why I am in Port-au-Prince. Going back to this question, were there no widows in Israel? There were. Widows were abundant in Israel. As a matter of fact, in Luke chapter 4, Jesus addresses this very question. The truth is, Jesus tells us, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when there was no rain for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine in the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except a widow at Zarephath. Jesus' words riled up the good folk of the synagogue. They drove him out of town. Does anybody remember what they planned to do next? Choir? Well, they would have stoned him, except they had a convenient cliff nearby. And so they were going to, hurl him over the edge of the cliff. And this is where we see in verse 30 a stealthy Jesus sneak through the crowd and escape. But what would have been so upsetting about Jesus' words? And what is significant about God calling Elijah to Zarephath? God turns things upside down. The Israelites expected the Lord to work in their midst, both in the time of Elijah and in the days of Jesus. As God's people, they expected the Lord to do things for and with them. Them, not the people of Zarephath. Yet God, even today, is not bound by human expectations. God isn't bound by what we think God should do. The story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath demonstrate how God can move and work outside our expectations. When things are bad, we ask for a miracle. And I want to ask, do we shift our expectations to what God's definition of a miracle might be? The widow represents this sense of otherness, someone beyond the way we think things should go. And as the main character, she's beyond the expectation. Elijah's the superstar. If this were a modern story, we would find God at work outside the religious institution, even outside the church. In 1 Kings, God works not only in an unfamiliar place, but in the midst of adherence to a different religion entirely. The widow gathered the sticks. That's an important aspect of this story. I don't know if it struck you as I was sharing the scripture reading. She wasn't gathering them for a craft. Drought decreased her possibilities. She gathered sticks because there was no other wood available. Today, in a village in sub-Saharan Africa, there will be women and children gathering sticks. Widows and orphans traveling great distances to get sticks for firewood. And we might wonder why they gather sticks when logs burn so much better. But if there are no logs, they have to gather what they can find, or they would not have fire. And they use fire to cook with. Without fire, they starve. And as forests diminish, the poorest women and children, and this is today, spend as much as 40% of their daylight hours gathering sticks to cook with. This isn't an ancient story in 1 Kings. This is one that resonates with our world today. There are others today. There are people outside of us today. There are people who struggle today. There are people who are waiting to die. This widow in 1 Kings gathers sticks and she is a means of Elijah's salvation. God picked her and works through her without her consent or even knowledge. She was ordained for this task. A woman, a foreigner, and a widow, which in ancient Near Eastern culture suggests that she was also destitute. In addition, she followed a different religion. What nerve! What audacity! What was God thinking? God, I don't think I'm going out on much of a theological limb here, was keenly aware of what God was doing. Because God thinks differently the way we do. And when we enter into the story, whether it's Scripture or it's today, we start to think differently than the way we thought before. So often, we want God to fit a box that we create. By containing God, we can explain and understand. We can make lists of do's and don'ts and find out who fits with God and who doesn't. But as we see with Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, God is not bound by my expectations or yours. Zarephath is an unlikely place, suggesting something new. The widow who gathered sticks is an unlikely hero, not Elijah, the biblical superstar. And in some ways, the widow tells us that God can use anyone, the poorest, least powerful person, or, God forbid, even me, or you. God doesn't always use the strong or the smart, or even the willing. Without boundaries, God becomes a little bit scary. This is good. I hope God's a little bit scary, because the faith journey is a little scary, but also incredibly exciting. I know I can speak for myself here, so maybe this is my own testimony, but I like control of my own life, my own trajectory. I know you all are comfortable not being in control, but I like to be in control. And when God fits my expectations, I get to increase my control. But when I let God take the lead, I'm not in control. Thank you for letting me share that. I know that it probably didn't resonate with anybody else. Elijah's story is one of somebody who we can get excited about. Of all the Old Testament characters, he would make the best t-shirt comic book superhero. But when we enter this story, we see the hero as someone else. We see the hero as the person God chose, not the one you or I would have identified. Let us leave our preconceived notions behind. Let us see where God leads. Yes, we can get excited about Elijah, but we can also find God's infinite and universal love moving beyond what we think and working in some pretty unlikely